Hey everyone, and thank you for joining us for episode number 8 of Really Bad Security. I am joined, of course, by Anthony and Lloyd, part of the Really Bad Security crew. And this week, we're really excited to have with us Rob Walk from Tenable. As you know, if you've watched the previous 7 episodes, Really Bad Security, the purpose of this is to talk about an area of security where maybe people or organizations feel like they're doing something correctly. Maybe this is how they've been doing it for a long time, or this is what they thought was the right way to do something. But as we find out, maybe it isn't. And Rob's going to talk to us about vulnerability management and how maybe the way that you've been looking at or doing vulnerability management isn't great, isn't even bad, but is really bad security. And so, Rob, with that, please introduce yourself and let's get this thing rolling.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today. When we talk about vulnerability management, I think you're right on. So my name is Rob Walk. I work for Tenable today. I've been here for about 5 years. I'm an enterprise security engineer. And one of the things that I do is I work with a lot of large organizations around understanding what the risks are in their environment in terms of vulnerabilities. And what we've seen over time, over the last few years really, is a shift from what I call traditional vulnerability management, which we base things on CVSS, to a risk-based approach. And so that's what we'll talk about today. We'll go through a number of things. We'll have a conversation about it, and I look forward to doing that. So thanks for the opportunity. So the first thing we see when we talk about vulnerabilities, to me, is this guy kind of epitomizes. If you've ever run a vulnerability management program, this is what you feel like, and I have. So prior to that, I worked for a global pharmaceutical manufacturer running a vulnerability management program. And the idea here is, when I have a number of vulnerabilities, which ones are important? Which ones are going to cause the breach? And so when we patch, most organizations do a poor job of cyber hygiene overall, especially when it comes to vulnerabilities and identifying which ones are important and which ones are going to cause a breach. And so that's what we've seen in the past. We've seen large organizations do a really good job, let me not say large, but organizations that are mature, have a mature vulnerability management program, do a really good job of prioritizing. They're pulling in things from other sources, and as an industry, we're moving that way over the last few years. So go into it a little bit deeper. So one of the things I frequently ask is, if you took a list of this is traditionally how we looked at vulnerabilities in scores, is we would determine the most at-risk asset. So this is an example. As which asset, has the most vulnerabilities. So if I were to ask you, Matt, Lloyd, Anthony, which one of these hosts do you think poses the most risk to your environment? What do you think?
The one with the highest score, right?
Yeah, if you're looking for the answer, well, of course, it's got to be the one with the highest score, right?
Got to be one with the highest score. That's what you think, yeah. Right? Until we learn more about the vulnerabilities themselves and the risk that they pose. This one doesn't necessarily tell you that. This one just tells you how many vulnerabilities it has, right? And then there's some weighting behind it. But really, what if I told you the last 2 hosts, the one on the bottom that had 2 critical vulnerabilities, had WannaCry and Equifax? What if those were the vulnerabilities, right? Or it had a Log4j. So traditionally, when we look at CVSS and the number of critical vulnerabilities, they don't put the risk calculation in there. So we really don't know that. So I got some bad news, right? So let's talk about bad news first, right? And it's not that Walter Matthau is coaching your kid's team, because that would kind of be bad. But let's go through some of those things. And the first thing is, I think when we look at security, a lot of times, and I think it's gotten better in the last few years, but a lot of times we've looked at, how secure are we? Security has been the people of no, and I think we've gotten better over the last few years, but we need to translate that into what risk looks like. We need to be an organization that identifies risk and helps communicate to the business what the risk is versus accepting the risk.
Right? So that's something that we talk about.
That's the goal of every cybersecurity department, right? If you're supposed to be communicating and telling your business what risk is, so for them to make good decisions on that information.
It should be, right? And I don't know that it always is. And if you look at like, what's always interesting to me is like, who gets let go or who gets fired when the security program fails somewhere, right? And it's always, someone's always going to get in. It's not a question of if, but when. And who gets fired? It's not the people behind, the business making those decisions not to fund security or upgrade this host. It's the folks in security that get fired. So we need to do a better job of identifying risk and documenting risk, right?
Well, and risk means that you have some level of understanding of your organization and the business that you're in and the space that you're in and all of that, right? So that goes along with stuff that we talk about all the time, that as security people, we are enablers of, or need to be enablers of, the company that you're working for to do things better, faster, and more secure. So, I think this is where sometimes some of us run into problems, is we get locked up in the technology without understanding the business that's around us and really where our place is, in the greater scheme of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's where, I like this saying that we need to operate at an acceptable level of risk for the organization, right? And every organization is different, whether it's a manufacturer or a financial institution. They're all going to have different levels of acceptable risk for their organizations. Yep. But we should be the identifying, as Anthony said, we should be identifying that risk, taking it to the business and allowing them to accept it. So if there's a breach, we're not losing our jobs anymore, right? I mean, that's kind of my goal, and that's a side thing that we talk about.
Well, that helps push the responsibility of those decisions off of the security team as well, right? I mean, because that's also not our job. We're not the ones running the business. We're the ones that should be showing the company, here's your risk. What of it are you willing to accept and not accept? The stuff you're not willing to accept, well, you have to spend the money and the resources to not accept that risk. And all this other stuff, if you're going to take that on, or if fixing the risk is $1 million and it's a $10,000 risk, then we're going to be okay operating at that level.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people, there's a misnomer in our career that our jobs are to secure business, and that's just not true. Our jobs are, what we've been discussing, and that's to communicate risk and help them remediate what risk they want to remediate. Because At the end of the day, we're here to enable the business, not, hinder them by closing every single hole and making them secure as possible. Because you know what? The most secure business doesn't have computers,
right?
Or isn't connected to the internet, or whatever it is, right? But you can't work that way.
Yeah, so there's been a shift, right? The security groups of 10 years ago were, no, you can't open that hole in the firewall, right? We're not going to allow it. To, okay, we need to allow the business to do what they need to do. We need to allow them to do the whether it's digital transformation or whatever it is, to allow them to move. And so part of that, so what I would say then, just kind of continuing that thought is that because of that, most vulnerability management programs are stale or broken, right? They're ineffective. And we can see that in the number of breaches that continue to happen, especially ones caused by, through vulnerabilities. And largely because they're taking a volume-based approach to vulnerability management. They're looking at the number of vulnerabilities that they have, and they're trying to solve this volume problem versus understanding what risk they pose. And so, largely when we talk about that, Gartner agrees with this. And so I know a lot of organizations, especially in the C-levels, C-suite, they look at Gartner as a trusted source. So, one of the things they said was by 2025, 70% of mid-sized enterprises that take the traditional volume-based approach to vulnerability management will have been breached through a known vulnerability. So to me, that's pretty impactful. And then I want to ask myself, why is that, right? So the question, and that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about risk-based approach, one of the reasons is because CVSS does not address some of the things that we need it to. In particular, it's designed to identify technical severity, but it doesn't. What we need to know, as security professionals, we need to know what risk that vulnerability poses and how quickly we should respond. Right. So I fully agree with that. So a couple things when we look at, CVSS and some of the other things I'll talk about CVSS is, there was 20-some thousand vulnerabilities discovered last year. Or I forget what they call it. So identified. And of that, when you look at the CVSS breakdown, I think like 65% of them from a CVSS version 3 perspective were higher critical. And so CVSS 2, when we moved from CVSS version 2 to version 3, the average score went from 6.5 to 7.4. 7.4 becomes high and critical in CVSS version 3, so we compounded a problem, right? So when it comes time to classifying and what do I go after, so that's part of the challenge. The other challenge is cyber criminals know this, right? And so what are they going after? So this is a report by Recorded Future. This was released last year. There is a new one. I need to update this. But the top 10 vulnerabilities used by cyber criminals. If you look at the CVSS scores, version 2, only 3 are rated, above 9 in the critical category. CVSS version 3 does a little bit better. It's 5. But one of them is so old it doesn't even have a CVSS version 3.
Well, I'd like to give some credit to NIST and the CVSS scores, because unadjusted CVSS v3 scores absolutely can give this sort of misnomer, right? Mm-hmm. But if I have this 7.8 that's exposed to the internet and I adjust my CVSS v3 score accordingly, it's going to go up to a 10.
Yeah, and I actually like CVSS in a number of ways, right? So there's a number of things that I utilize, and I think CVSS vectors are incredibly powerful when you're identifying exposure of a vulnerability, right? I don't want to call it risk because there's another piece we'll talk about. But I think those things, when you understand whether it's remotely exploitable and your internet, it's internet facing, user interaction requirement. So I think from a vector perspective, you're absolutely right. There's a number of things that are really important. The other thing I point out to a lot of organizations that I work with is that these things, I call them data points, right? The role of an analyst is incredibly important because there are things that we still don't know when it comes to vulnerabilities. So things like, how do you know if it's internet facing? Well, if it's got a public IP address, it's great. But how do I know it's not going through a DMZ? If it's not a DMZ server, or things like there's Internet Explorer vulnerabilities. If it's on my server and it's a 0-day, but my servers can't get to the internet, it doesn't matter what the score is or what kind of even if it's a high risk vulnerability from a threat intelligence feed perspective, if they can't get to the internet, there's really very little risk. So I call all these things data points, and the role of the vulnerability analyst remains critically important. So then I asked, there's a lot of great things. We said there's some challenges, so, if we looked in our crystal ball and we tried to look out, what do we do? And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think as an industry, we looked at some of the things that the organizations with the most mature programs had, and we tried to help from a technology perspective. Now, before I go there, and I think, Matt, you mentioned this earlier, security is not about technology 100%, right? It's really about people, process, technology. So to me, it's having a lot of good people in the right position, coming up with the right processes, and then utilizing the technology as enabler for you to be successful, right? So that's first and foremost in what you do in any security program. The next piece is really around understanding where you're at in terms of your maturity. And I work with organizations. I asked one organization once, hey, where do you think you are in terms of maturity on this scale? And they said, I think we're left of 0. and so I think that people are all over the place, right? And there's no right or wrong answer. The question I frequently ask organizations that I work with is, where are you today and where would you like to get to the next 18 to 24 months? Most organizations are in the 1 to 2, maybe closing on the 3. I've only worked with one organization in the last 5 years that I've been doing this, who I would consider close to a 5. The rest are kind of 3s and 4s.
So what do organizations need to do to go from a level 2 to 3? Like, what can we do to make that jump? Because a lot of the organizations I see are level 2 or 1, like you mentioned.
Yeah. So my perspective, and that's a great question, is adopting a risk-based approach, right? And so we'll talk about what that is for the rest of the time here. And to me, it's utilizing the tools that are out there. So process is important. People, process, patching, those things are important. But what I'll show you here coming up is that what we need to understand is the risk that individual vulnerabilities pose. Again, if I take a volume-based approach, we looked at it before, like I don't know what things are most risky. And so what I want to know then is, how do I look at risk, like risk focused? So when am I doing my analysis, am I injecting like threat intelligence feeds to understand where the risk lies? Am I looking at things that are attacker and threat focused? Am I looking at patching based on risk to critical assets? And then the metrics that I'm looking at, are they threat-driven metrics and trends, not just traditional volume-based metrics like how many vulnerabilities did we remediate this month, right? Because those metrics don't mean anything in terms of risk. I didn't drive down risk in my environment, because if I remediated 1,000 lows, it doesn't mean anything. Even if I remediated 1,000 criticals, if they weren't necessarily ones that were being exploited in the wild, kind of like the recorded future report, that doesn't really matter. Did I reduce risk in my environment? And so that's what we'll talk about.
Right. And I one thing that always comes to mind when we talk about number of vulnerabilities and the things that we see in reports, I think very specifically of seeing the Suite 32 attack, which is, you have to have very specific situations, and it's very hard to actually complete and exploit. But if you do any sort of external vulnerability scan, especially on, a lot of your publicly facing software and websites and what have you, it's almost always listed, and people are like, oh my God, this is a medium. We need to, remediate this right away. But to your point, just because that it's there doesn't necessarily mean that it's exploitable or is a risk to the organization.
Yep. And that's where we go back to traditional vulnerability management. It doesn't talk about that, right? We haven't traditionally, organizations or companies like mine didn't integrate that threat intelligence feed, right? And so you're seeing that more and more. And so let's talk about what that looks like and how to utilize that within a program. So risk is the intersection of a threat, a vulnerability, and an asset. I know that's spelled wrong, but I grabbed it off the interwebs and somebody else spelled it wrong and I just left it. So that's where risk is, right? I think we can agree on that. And so the idea then is start to talk about risk in terms, start talking about vulnerabilities in terms of risk that we can then share with the business. So, if the input is, when I look at like a risk assessment, and if we start talking with risk groups in organizations, right, they understand the inputs of a threat, an asset, and a vulnerability. And that's what we just talked about. And then the output of a risk assessment is the impact, the likelihood, the countermeasures, controls. So people need better information in order to be able to make the decisions that we're giving. So if we're going to tell them, hey, here's the risk, if we just tell them it's CVSS 10, it's bad, that doesn't mean much. Even if we tell them some CVSS vectors, they're not technical. That doesn't mean much to them. But if we can start telling them the impact, the likelihood, and some countermeasures, that gives them a little different perspective into it. So let's talk about what that looks like. So if we have a vulnerability and we have a threat to that vulnerability, right? A threat, we then create some type of, what we've done and other vendors have done the same, is you create a metric around that. So for argument's sake, we'll call it a vulnerability priority rating. So at this point, because I know there's a threat, we use a threat intel feed. Again, others do. It's not unique to Tenable. I think we have a unique approach to it, and so that's why I like being here. But the end of the day is, we need to score it differently, right? And so for us, we use a 0 to 10, very much like CVSS does. And it basically it's just rescoring, 10 being the most critical. And so what that would look like is, if I look at the CVSS base score for this vulnerability, it's a 7.8. If I look at the vulnerability priority rating, when I look at things like if I've introduced threat intelligence feeds, and we'll talk about what those are, what kind of data inputs you should be having, this is a 10. So this is a what I call the pants on fire, drop everything, go remediate. And to me, it's really these key drivers. And so the idea then becomes, how do you know? How do you go and explain to the business, right? We talked about it before, a risk assessment. How did I then go and take this information back to the business? Maybe I'm working in an operation environment. It's operational technology, and we need to convince them that there's downtime, or convince them that there's something to do. Here's what the risk is. And so for this particular vulnerability, we can see the threat recency is 0 to 7 days. Threat intensity is very high. So the threat is still existent, even though when we look down at the age of the vulnerability, it's 60 to 100 days old. Exploit code maturity is very high. And then we're seeing it in threat sources. We're seeing it in places like social media, mainstream media, hacker forums, dark web. We're seeing it in a lot of places. So we're taking that threat intelligence data and then giving that information to the analyst in the vulnerability management team and allowing you to then go have a risk-based conversation versus a technical conversation with people. So to me, this makes a lot more sense when and the idea then really is to reduce the number of vulnerabilities that you have to focus on, right? So we talked about the volume-based approach where I look at thousands of critical vulnerabilities to saying, I need to look at the vulnerabilities that are posing risk to my environment. We talked about the analyst, still important to have an analyst because again, if this is on an Internet Explorer vulnerability on a server that can't get to the internet, I still have to go and think about that, not necessarily a risk to my environment. But identifying the risk of a vulnerability in terms of, can it be exploited? Is it not just exploitable, right? Because that's one of the things we always use, but is it currently being exploited? That's what we want to know. So for us in particular, is this an effective method, right? And I think about just when I look at methods and introducing threat intelligence feeds and coming up with different scorings, and for us it seems to be an effective method. So when we remap those top 10 vulnerabilities used by cyber criminals in 2020 and interject that VPR score, that vulnerability priority rating that utilizes CVSS, and it's an algorithm that also injects some threat intelligence data into it, I think we can see that it does a great job of then remapping the priority that you should be looking at from a CVSS perspective.
How many of these are Exchange?
I have to go back and look. Probably a fair amount. I'm not sure. I don't think all of them are Microsoft. I think a couple are Microsoft. There's probably more Adobe in there than anything, and maybe a Java or two. And so, as we talked about a little bit, it's really about reprioritizing and looking at vulnerabilities in a different way. So going from a way in which we have this volume-based approach, on the left, we're looking at 65% of our vulnerabilities are high and critical, to a place where we can cut it down to, maybe 5% of our vulnerabilities we need to go look at today, because those are the ones that are posing the most risk. Those are the ones that are being not just that don't have exploits, but they're being exploited in the wild.
What's interesting there is you would see maybe some go from medium on the left to critical on the right, or vice versa, right? So it's not just further sorting through those, it's actually making that information better. So now if I'm a vulnerability analyst at a organization, I know that those criticals are actually truly critical, right? Versus I've got 1,000 criticals. And I think sometimes, like, especially the larger your organization gets, like, these numbers start to get so big that you get kind of lost in that. And like, well, how am I going to get, 5,000 things patched? And so then you end up, when things become too chaotic, too complicated, right? We just, I think as humans, stop doing them, walk away from them, whatever. So.
Absolutely. So I'm going to kind of skip over a little bit, and in because of time, I'm going to kind of wrap up here a little bit, and I'm going to say there's some good news, right? And I think the good news is, and that reminds me of my daughter, by the way. So she loves muddy puddles. And so I saw this picture. I'm like, man, this is my daughter jumping in muddy puddles. And we go out when it rains and we jump in muddy puddles. So one of our favorite things to do. So Anthony, you get to look forward to that really soon. Put on some rain boots and run out in the rain and jumping in some muddy puddles. So the good news is here that Gartner says by 2022, which is this year, is that organizations that use a risk-based vulnerability management method will suffer 80% fewer breaches. And so again, it's not just me saying that as someone who's worked in the industry, who's obviously representing a vendor. This is Gartner saying that this method is effective, it works, and organizations should be overall adopting it, right? I'll end with this. This quote here, and it says, "Those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. Yet those who do study history are doomed to stand by helplessly while everyone else repeats it." And I think, going back to the bread, the moldy bread, right? Vulnerability management's been stale, it's been crusty. We've been doing the same thing for 20 years. And we need to do something different, right? So I feel a lot in my role. I've been watching folks continue to talk about the same thing in CVSS, and we need to help them move into a risk-based approach, right? Instead of just continually to watch the same thing over and over again. So with that, I'll finish up. I thank you guys for the opportunity to talk about risk-based vulnerability management. I think it's important. I think it's impactful. I think it's a great way to change your program and go from one in which you're looking at that volume-based approach to really drilling down and focusing on the number of vulnerabilities. Like, doesn't mean get rid of your patch program, right? You need a robust patch program. You need to do the other security things. But when it comes to identifying risk and which vulnerabilities I should really be focusing on that are still in my environment, that risk-based approach, I think can really help reduce the number that you're looking at, and utilizing CVSS and some of those other vectors can continue to help as data points. So thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Absolutely, Rob. Thank you. Good stuff there. And so I love the fact that we can make our lives easier and our organizations more secure, and all by taking this risk-based approach, which requires you to be more integrated into your business, right? All of those things, really good security. And if you're still doing this volume-based, right, you're doing tons of extra work that you may or may not need to actually be doing. That is truly really bad security. Rob, thanks again. Lloyd, Anthony, we'll do this again soon. And for everyone that's watching, please like, subscribe, do all the fun YouTube stuff, and we'll see you again real soon. Thanks, everyone.